Well, welcome everybody to the Rumi Forum. We're delighted to have with us a senior career diplomat, Ambassador David Shinn, with us today. And he will be speaking on the rise of non-Western influence in Africa. Ambassador David Shinn's been teaching as an adjunct professor in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University for the past 10 years. Prior to that, he served for 37 years as a Foreign Service officer in the State Department with overseas assignments in Lebanon, Kenya, Tanzania, Mauritania, Cameroon, Sudan, and as an ambassador to Burkina Faso and Ethiopia. He's published extensively on issues related to the Horn of Africa and is currently writing a book on China-Africa relations. He has his PhD from GW. Please welcome with me Ambassador David Shinn.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. We're a small group, so I'll try to keep this fairly informal. And I really do encourage questions from you and promise to allow plenty of time to respond to your questions. I'm going to talk about non-Western influence in Africa. I'm going to arbitrarily focus on China, India, Russia, Brazil, and Iran. Now, you could take any number of additional countries and add them to that list, Turkey, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and indeed several others. But I can only do so much in the amount of time that I have, so I'll confine my remarks to those countries. I would also point out that you could make this same presentation about other parts of the world. In other words, you could look at non-Western influence taking place now in Latin America, the Middle East, South Asia, other parts of Asia. I just happen to be a specialist on Africa, and again, due to time constraints, I'm going to confine it to Africa. But the fact that we're talking about non-Western influence in Africa doesn't mean that that's the only place that this has become a major new development in the world. Non-Western actors are becoming more engaged on a global basis, not just Africa. Let me start with China. I would suggest that there are four principal interests that China has in Africa. I'll just tick them off and then I'll get into them a little more deeply. First is access to oil and minerals, natural resources. Second is an interest in political support from African countries. Third is ending Taiwan's diplomatic presence in Africa. And fourth is developing a larger market in Africa for Chinese exports. Let's take those one by one, starting with the whole question of natural resources and access to them. Today, China imports about 1/3 of its total oil imports from Africa. Now, that doesn't mean that it gets 1/3 of all of its oil from Africa, because it obviously has its own domestic consumption and still gets a fairly significant amount domestically. But in terms of oil imports, 1/3 comes from Africa, and that percentage is slowly growing. About 90% of its cobalt comes from Africa, 35% of its manganese, 30% of its tantalum, and even 5% of its hardwood timber. And I could go on and list other minerals that come out of Africa in significant proportions. And without this strong continuing flow of natural resources from Africa and elsewhere, I'm not suggesting that Africa is the sole contributor to its key minerals and oil products that it needs, but to the extent that Africa does contribute to China's imports of these critical materials, it keeps the Chinese economy humming. And as you all know, it's had a very successful run in terms of its growth, GNP growth rate, which has been going at about 9% for the last 3 decades. I don't think any country in the world has a record that's even close to that. And if these imports were to end for any reason, it would put a real crimp in the ability of China to maintain that strong growth rate, and hence it would be a real problem for the Communist Party, and you probably would see major leadership changes going on in China. So China's looking at the African sourcing of these materials as a long-term strategic issue. This is not a fly-by-night kind of decision. This is something that China wants to maintain over the long term, because it sees itself as continuing to have a very high GDP growth rate. Turning to the political side of the issue, China is interested in Africa because it's 53 independent countries. That is more than 1/4 of the membership of the United Nations, which is 192 countries. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of these countries vote as a bloc. They don't. But there is a tendency among the African countries to sort of vote along the same lines. And if Africa can convince the greater number of 53 to support their position in international fora, that works to their advantage in international policymaking. They're particularly concerned in places like the UN Human Rights Council, where they sometimes are singled out for criticism by the United States or by Western countries generally. They're also interested in African support in the World Trade Organization. The Africans even have 3 votes in the Security Council every year. It's a rotating African participation in the Security Council. They don't have veto power, but they do have votes, and China's interested in those votes. And of course, the Africans are interested in China's veto in the Security Council, because either the veto or the threat of a veto can sometimes play an important role when you have disputed issues like Darfur or the leadership in Zimbabwe. The third major interest that China has in Africa is to eliminate any Taiwan diplomatic presence on the continent. Only 4 of the 53 countries recognize Taiwan today, and they're not very important countries. But China is absolutely adamant and wants all 4 to switch to recognition of Beijing based on its one China policy. And oftentimes this aspect of Chinese diplomacy is forgotten about or overlooked. Because by and large they are accepted by most countries around the world. But we forget that there still are a number of countries, including 4 in Africa, that still recognize Taiwan, and China wants that brought to an end. And the final interest is the desire to build a market in Africa for Chinese exports. Today, or not today, but in 2008, Chinese trade with Africa reached $107 billion. That made it the number 2 most important trading partner with Africa after the United States. And it is projected that China will surpass the United States this year, if it didn't already pass the United States in 2009, but we don't have the figures yet for 2009. That will be an important development once China passes the U.S. as the major trade partner for Africa, and it almost inevitably is going to happen. But if you look at that trade, one sort of caveat on China's trade with Africa, even though they are or soon will be the most important trade partner with Africa, China-Africa trade constitutes only 4% of global Chinese trade. So in the grand scheme of things, Africa is not that important. At some point, though, it probably will be up in the low double digits, and at that point, Africa will loom quite important in terms of Chinese trade. When you look at the nature of the trade with these 53 countries, you have some very different things that are going on. There are some 15 African oil producers that have very large trade surpluses with China, but then you have most of the rest of the African countries that don't have oil or minerals, and they tend to have very large deficits with Africa, and they also tend to be the poorer countries on the continent. So the China trade issue it cuts both ways. The oil and mineral exporters are very happy. The rest of the continent is a little concerned about the way this trade relationship is going because they're building up enormous deficits. On foreign investment, we get into a numbers problem here. No one really knows how much foreign investment China has in Africa. I've looked real hard at this question, and I've come up with a figure of probably in excess of $20 billion. It may be a bit above that, but one, it's very difficult to define what investment means in China, and it's very hard to get numbers. The Chinese are not very transparent. But let's, for the sake of argument, say somewhere around $20 billion, which is actually higher than the official statistics coming out of China. But if you look at China's investment globally, it constitutes only about 4% of that investment. The vast majority of Chinese investment is obviously in Asia. But even Chinese investment in the United States is probably higher than 4%. So again, in the grand scheme of things, not too significant. Most of it has been in the extractive industries, oil particularly, but you did have an interesting development a couple of years ago when China bought 20% of Standard Bank of South Africa and paid $5.6 billion for it. So China is branching out beyond the extractive industries. In terms of how you define aid and the transparency of the figures, China just does not announce country by country aid figures. So there's an awful lot of guesswork going on here in terms of how much real aid China is providing the continent. Again, I've taken a pretty close look at this, and the figure I come up with is about $1.5 billion annually of aid, what you could call OECD type aid, going to Africa, which isn't paltry. I mean, that's a fairly significant amount. It's well below the United States or the European Union, but it's still not insignificant. What you have going on, in addition to this aid, is they've had a very long-standing program of sending medical teams to Africa. Some 15,000 medical personnel dating back to 1963 have gone to some 47 African countries, and they claim to have treated 180 million patients in the process. I don't know how they count them, but anyway, that's the figure they give out. China also has a new program that's very similar to the American Peace Corps program. It's very small by comparison, but they're active now in about a half a dozen of African countries. It seems to be a fairly successful program. What China really does that you hear more about are these major loans that they provide to African countries. And these are really more like commercial deals than they are aid. They do have a concessionary component to them, and the concessionary amount of the loan could legitimately be called aid. And if, for example, they're only charging 0.75% interest, well, that has an aid component to it. If they're charging 6% interest, then for all practical purposes, it's a commercial deal. But they've done these kinds of loans in countries like Angola, $13 billion worth. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, $9 billion. Niger, $5 billion. And Ethiopia, $2.5 billion. And these are largely based on providing that money to the host government as they wish to use it. In most cases, the host government chooses to build large infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, dams, rehabbing railways, etc. And who do you suppose is brought in to do all those infrastructure projects? Chinese companies. So although there is a local component of labor and there's a local component of buying food to feed personnel working on projects, and maybe some local products are purchased, the vast majority of the money is sourced right back to China, so that in a sense you've got the money sort of whizzing around banks in China, going from XM Bank to perhaps the Bank of China, or whatever companies or whatever banks the Chinese companies are banking with. It's a good deal for China, but the Africans are happy with it too because they're getting someone to do their infrastructure. And they're doing it fairly cheaply, and no one else seems to be much interested. Either that or they can't compete. China has, as its hallmark policy in Africa, very strong state-to-state relations, has a premium on that, has an embassy in 48 of the 49 countries with which it has diplomatic relations. Somalia being the only one that it does not have an embassy in, and that's because of the security situation. Hu Jintao has made 6 trips to Africa. 2 as vice president, 4 as president. Premier Wen Jiabao has made an equally impressive number of visits to Africa. And perhaps to underscore the attention that high-level Chinese officials give to Africa, if you go back to 1991, the Chinese foreign minister, every single year, without exception, has made his first overseas trip anywhere to Africa, usually in January. Since 1991. If you think the Africans don't take note of that, think again. I don't know how many trips the U.S. Secretary of State has made since 1991, but I can assure you it's not been even close to one per year, probably less than half that. So the Chinese are very much interested in high-level contacts. And they have another layer of contact that most Western countries don't have, and that is the senior Communist Party officials. They are frequently going to Africa, and they are frequently hosting African party leaders in China. So it's a whole other layer of interaction that the West doesn't have. This relationship is now being organized for the most part by the China-Africa Forum, which meets every 3 years, just met in Egypt late last year. You also have interaction involving Xinhua, the Chinese news agency. They have some 20 bureaus in Africa. You have Confucius Institutes going up on the continent. There are at least 6 at the moment and many more on the drawing boards. Africa is involved in radio transmission to Africa in Chinese, English, Swahili, and probably they will add other languages. China is doing a lot of training of Africans, including journalists and diplomats, and they're offering a pretty impressive scholarship program. The idea was to increase up to 4,000 scholarships by last year. I don't know whether they made that goal or not. There are no military bases, Chinese military bases in Africa. They say they don't want any. On the other hand, there is fairly significant interaction between the Chinese military and various African military organizations with all 49 countries that they recognize. In some cases, it's far more important than with others. There are 14 Chinese defense attaché offices in Africa, accredited to some 30 different African countries. And you have a significant number of African defense attachés in Beijing. Just recently, you've had China join the anti-piracy operation off of Somalia. They've had 4 different contingents of naval vessels in that arena over the last year and a half or so. Now, everything is not free sailing for the Chinese in Africa. There are a number of areas where they run into problems. I'm just going to tick them off, and if you want to come back to any of them in the Q&A, I'll be happy to do it. China, for example, draws criticism in the following areas. Lack of support for democracy and good governance. It doesn't really pay any attention to that. Human rights practices. I mean, the Chinese record on human rights leaves a great deal to be desired. They're certainly not going to go out and criticize the Africans. Transparency, not good. Corruption, it's a problem in Africa, it's a problem in China. Questionable environmental practices. It's been a very troublesome issue in China. They're starting to focus on it, but it's also carried over to some of their African activities. Poor worker safety and fair labor practices, not a strong point for the Chinese. The export to Africa of harmful and counterfeit products. Well, if they can do that to the United States with their toothpaste and their lead-painted toys, you can imagine what they can do in the developing countries that have no capacity whatsoever to monitor this stuff. Substandard corporate business practices are just not up to speed with the Western countries on good corporate social responsibility, but they're improving. Reluctance to provide training and support to African manufacturing so that it can compete with the Chinese in the global market. They're starting to do some of that, but there's a long ways to go. And obviously, you don't want to start setting up or encouraging manufacturing in Africa that's going to compete directly with Chinese companies. You could probably make the same criticism about the West. And then finally, inadequate controls over the arms exports to Africa, particularly small arms. They're a major arms exporter. Okay, enough about China, and I will have said more about China than I will the other countries, simply because I've spent a lot more time researching China than I have the others. Let me turn to India and give you just a real quick thumbnail sketch of India's activity in Africa, and you can draw some comparisons on your own. First off, India is the world's largest democracy, and it's probably more of a direct challenge to China in Africa than is the United States or even Europe to China. India imports about 15% of its oil from Africa, but its trade with Africa constitutes only about 5% of total Indian trade. So again, it sees Africa as an important location for raw materials. India has some advantages over China. It's physically closer to Africa. It's more appealing to those democracies in Africa. There aren't a lot of them, but there are a number of African democracies, and I think they just find more affinity for India than they do with China. The Indians speak a common language with at least the Anglophones in Africa. The Chinese, they've got to come in from scratch, and I mean, no one, except for the small Chinese communities, speaks Chinese. So they have to learn a second language before they can even communicate with the Africans. The Indians, at least with the Anglophones, have no problem. Indian culture is fairly well understood in Africa. Indian movies are popular on the continent. Chinese movies, not really. India's important private sector is appealing to some African countries. It's a very powerful private sector. Chinese has a private sector too, but it's not nearly as influential as India's. Like China, India has an impressive GDP growth rate. A little bit less than China, but it's still impressive. And India also sends far more peacekeepers to UN operations in Africa than does China, although China sends an awful lot more than the US does. India has begun to formalize its relationship with Africa. It doesn't have anything quite as formal as the China-Africa Forum, which has been around since the year 2000. India's a little later to the game, and they're still trying to figure out how best to coordinate their activities with Africa. The size of India's economy is well behind that of China, so it doesn't have the resources to compete with China. India also has fewer embassies in Africa, 48 for China, 27 for India. India, like China, follows a no-strings-attached policy to its assistance and its commercial deals. They don't go in and beat up on the Africans on human rights grounds or good governance. They don't talk about it, but they don't do it. And the Africans, of course, don't want to be beat up on, so they appreciate the fact that neither India nor China hammers them on these issues. Like China, India has a duty-free tariff preference scheme for exports from the poorer African countries. And India has also extended a line of credit to African countries that over the last 5 years is valued at about $2 billion, well under what China is doing, but nevertheless growing, and I think with the passage of time will become more important. Indian aid emphasizes training for 1,000 Africans annually. They're very big on training. So is China, but proportionally, India's, I think, doing more with training. In addition, you have about 15,000 African students that are attending colleges and technical schools in India each year. That's far more than you have going off on their own to China. And again, the language problem would explain most of that. If you're from an Anglophone country, India's a natural choice. It's cheap, it's closer. China's unless you speak Chinese, you just can't do it. India plans to provide about $5 million in aid to Africa over the next 5 years, well under what China is doing, but nevertheless a growing figure. India does have a more aggressive security relationship with the African countries than China does. China is sort of holding back on the security side. India is particularly trying to expand its naval collaboration with the African countries. One, it's closer, and two, and it's not called the Indian Ocean for nothing. The Indians are very concerned about the Chinese or anyone else coming into the Indian Ocean and trying to push them aside or reduce their influence, and they're paying especially close attention to Chinese plans for the Indian Ocean. Okay, turning to Brazil. Brazil, probably the most important fact to keep in mind about Brazil is that it's home to at least 70 million people of African descent. The United States, we all know of the important African American community here. It is proportionally more important in Brazil. And the Brazilians take this very seriously, and they're very proud of it. Many Brazilians actually trace their ancestry directly to Nigeria and Benin, a little tiny country in the West African Bight. There's also a natural affinity for Brazilians with the Lusophone countries in Africa, and there are 4 of them in Africa. And there's quite a close connection between the Portuguese-speaking nations around the world and Portugal. Brazil maintains embassies in 28 African countries. I mean, who would have thunk? Brazil has an embassy in 28 African countries? There are only 53 of them after all. Brazilian President da Silva has made 9, count them, 9 visits to Africa since he took office in 2003. How many visits do you think the American president has made to Africa since 2003? 2, count them. Brazil's there 9 times. India, Brazil, and South Africa have created in 2004 a strategic alliance known as the India-Brazil-South Africa Dialogue Forum, known as IBSA, and they meet regularly. It has a security connotation to it. Brazil's trade with Africa reached $25 billion in 2008, way behind China, but nevertheless it's getting up there into some real numbers. Brazil seeks African markets for its exports and investment opportunities for its companies. It depends heavily for Africa for minerals and energy to supply its expanding economy. Brazil's also looking to Africa for help in obtaining a permanent UN Security Council seat. So they want African votes for that, should the opportunity come up or should the Security Council decide to expand the council. And African countries are turning increasingly to Brazil for technical and scientific assistance. Brazil is positioning itself in Africa to help ensure its food security and its energy needs. Turning to Russia, there was a sharp decline in Russian engagement in Africa after the end of the Cold War. It was very deeply engaged on the continent during the Cold War, both trying to compete with the United States, with the West on the one hand, and with China on the other during the Sino-Soviet conflict. The Cold War ends, Russia loses its political interest in the continent, Russia's economy collapses initially, not really in a position to compete. Well, all of that has begun to change in recent years. The economy is returning with a vengeance in Russia. They have large quantities of oil. Oil has paid off handsomely, and Russia's back in business in Africa. The one thing Russia maintained throughout this period of time was its impressive embassy structure across the continent. They never shut them down. They shut a few down. Yeah, they reduced staff, but they kept the embassies open. So it's easy for them to come back quickly onto the continent. Former President Putin's September 2006 visit to South Africa, the first by a Russian leader, signaled a new intention by Russia to re-engage in Africa. The Russian Prime Minister followed Putin in March of 2007. President Medvedev traveled to Egypt, Nigeria, Namibia, and Angola with a 100-strong business delegation in 2009. Now, Russia's well behind the United States and China in terms of the trade relationship. In fact, its trade with the continent's only about $7 billion. Remember I said earlier that China's $107 billion. But it's growing, and it's growing fairly quickly. Russia has invested since the year 2000 more than $5 billion in the purchase of African assets, mainly in the energy field. Business has become the central focus of Russian interest in Africa. In 2009, Egypt signed a 10-year strategic cooperation agreement that includes a proposal to build Egypt's first nuclear power plant. Russia signed an agreement with South Africa to establish a command and control center for the Russian Space Agency to train South African space personnel, that's right, South African space personnel, and to build communication satellites. And it will launch a satellite for Angola. Russian aid to Africa remains exceedingly modest. They'll try to provide somewhere between $400 to $500 million of aid annually to Africa. They haven't even reached that level yet. Russia has resumed large-scale arms sales to African countries. They never stopped, really, but they seem to have taken an uptick in recent years. Between 2000 and 2007, Russia sold more than $1 billion of arms to African countries. Russia is the largest supplier of arms to Sudan. Conventional wisdom is that it's China. It's not. It's Russia. And that included a recent sale of 12 MiG-29s, one of the highest performing aircraft that Russia has. Ethiopia continues to rely heavily upon arms from Russia too, as do a number of other countries. Russia has been a significant not a particularly significant contributor of troops to UN peacekeeping operations, but it still provides considerably more peacekeepers to these operations than the United States does, but less than China does. Russian naval vessels are part of the anti-piracy operation off of the coast of Somalia. And let me wrap up with a few comments on Iran, and then we'll just turn this over to Q&A. Iran stepped up its engagement in Africa about 5 years ago. It's never been isolated itself from Africa. It's always had its foot in the door, as it were. But there was a very notable uptick in Iranian interest more or less 5 years ago. And I suspect you can link it to a combination of isolation by the West, on the one hand, and a desire to undercut Israel in Africa on the other. And these two factors, I think, for the most part, explain why Iran has become more engaged in the continent. President Khatami visited Nigeria, Senegal, Mali, Sierra Leone, Benin, Zimbabwe, and Uganda in 2005. There have been numerous exchange visits between African and Iranian leaders ever since. Sudan has been the centerpiece of Iranian activity in Africa. Senegalese President Wade visited Iran in 2006 and in 2008, so they're not confining their activities just to the northeast part of Africa, which is geographically closest to Iran. They've made a special effort to build up ties with Northeast Africa, and they indeed, Iranian leaders spend more time in that part of Africa. Eritrean President Isaias visited Tehran in 2008. Zimbabwe has been another focus of Iran's interest. In addition to Libya, Algeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and Malawi, of all places. Now, most of this interaction with African countries has concerned trade and investment. In 2007, Iran exported just over $4 billion worth of goods to Africa, but imported only about $500 million from Africa. So its trade is even a little bit below Russia's, but one would probably expect that. It's economically a much smaller country than Russia. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited Kenya, Djibouti, and the Comoro Islands in February of 2009. And Iran regularly requests and often obtains from African interlocutors public statements of support for its nuclear program, its so-called civilian nuclear program. And one of the things that the Iranians always do when they're going around the continent visiting with African leaders is say, won't you please say something publicly that we then can put in the press that you are supportive of our effort to build a civilian nuclear program. And many African countries are accommodating that request. Well, I'm going to stop there, and the point of this was just to try to lay out identifying those countries that are particularly active in Africa today, the magnitude of their activity, to emphasize that they're not doing this just in Africa, they're doing this in other parts of the world too, and to underscore the point that there are a number of countries I didn't mention that I could easily have put on this list. The story might not be quite as impressive as that I've tried to spell out for you, but it would nevertheless underscore that you are seeing a significant increase in non-Western activity in Africa, particularly over the last 10 years. Thank you very much.
You mentioned the countries, several countries, business relations, military relations, and medical aids to the continent. What about the education institutions? I know the ones of Turkey. There are lots of high schools, Turkish high schools in the continent. What about the other countries, foreign colleges, foreign high schools, or education institutions?
For the most part, the educational link takes place back in the country that one is talking about. That is, training Africans in China, training Africans in India. I'm not sure. I don't think Brazil's really doing any of this that I'm aware of. I doubt that Iran is doing any of it in any significance. Russia's doing a little of it. Russia used to do, or the Soviet Union used to do a lot. at the Friendship University in Moscow. There was an enormous amount of training for Africans. Russia's drawn back enormously on that. Now you do have a fair number, particularly of Indian teachers in Africa, teaching in either technical schools or at the university level. So the Indians are very big on going that direction to Africa. I mentioned the Confucius Institutes. There are only half a dozen or so at the moment. Those are really designed to do a couple of things. One, teach Mandarin, and you're seeing more and more Mandarin taught all over the continent, either through the Confucius Institute on the one hand, or special programs that African universities are setting up on the other. And in some cases, the Chinese government is almost certainly helping out in staffing the Chinese language programs. There are small numbers of Chinese teachers that are teaching in Africa. But this is a bit of a problem because of the language issue. It means you've got to identify Chinese teachers who speak French, Portuguese, English, Arabic, and there just aren't that many. So the Chinese are very limited in what they can actually do on the continent. Now the Chinese build a lot of schools and some universities in Africa, but they do it for these are business deals. These are contracts where they get paid to build these structures, and occasionally they will be associated with an aid project, particularly primary schools. China has provided provided funding for a number of primary schools that effectively qualify as being aid projects. But most of these deals are commercial deals. They may be in connection with a Chinese loan such as I mentioned earlier, but still the idea theoretically is to pay back the Chinese government. So those are not really Chinese schools. They're simply built by Chinese companies, and then they're turned over to the host government, and there's really nothing left to associate them with China except the fact that they were built by Chinese. And they probably, for the most part, don't have any Chinese instructors in them. And then there's a scholarship program that I mentioned for India and China.
My name is Vladimir, and thank you very much for a very comprehensive talk. I had a number of questions, but they have been answered so far. I mentioned to get one. I'm interested in the Chinese position. It's unique in a sense. It is a receiver of the foreign aid and a donor of the foreign aid. And significant amount of foreign aid dedicated to the African continent. And I wonder to what extent this policy contributes in the success in the African continent. I mean, beyond of the altruistic intentions.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's an issue that people don't think a lot about. In fact, probably most people don't even understand that is happening. And I can't quote for you chapter and verse all the various inputs into China in the form of foreign assistance. I can give you a rough idea as to how it works. For example, the World Bank has been and continues to be a major contributor to Chinese development. I don't know what the dollar amounts are today, but over time it's been a very substantial amount of World Bank money going into China. Now, at the same time, China is a member of the World Bank, and China has a contribution to the World Bank, which I believe is around 3%, maybe 4% of total contributions to the bank. It's actually surprisingly high when you stop to think that they haven't been active in the bank for that many years. So on the one hand, you've got China putting X number of dollars into the World Bank in the form of contributions, but you have them taking out a far greater amount from the bank. And it's that aspect that is not commonly understood around the world. Let me give you another example, and I know what the figures are on this because I was attending a session last week dealing with it. And that's the Global Fund for countering HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. China's a founding member of the Global Fund. China has put into the Global Fund $14 million. That's not very much. $14 million. They have committed a total of $16 million, so they've got $2 million to go yet. But China is a major recipient of the Global Fund, and they have already taken out from the Global Fund about $700 million, and they have requests in to take $1.9 billion from the Global Fund. So you put in $14 million in the slot, and you take back out maybe up to $1.9 billion. That's a pretty good deal. But at the same time, it gives you the ability to tell the world, hey, we're members of the Global Fund, we contribute to the Global Fund. Don't ask us how much we contribute, but we contribute. And they do. And I give them credit for that. Better that they contribute something than nothing at all. But it is one of these sort of anomalies in what's going on in China today, because China continues to like to underscore the point that it is a developing country. Now, I've only traveled to the coastal regions of China, Shanghai, Beijing area. And I don't know how many of you have been to Shanghai and Beijing, but anyone who thinks that Shanghai and Beijing is a developing part of the world, you've got to have blinders on. I mean, when you take the MAG train from Shanghai, downtown Shanghai, to the Shanghai airport, which is some distance away, at 450 kilometers an hour, that ain't the developing world that I know. That is really some of the most modern technology in the world. Now, where the rub comes is when I gather, and I haven't been there, when you go out to Western China, you get into some very poor areas where you can truly make the argument that these people live in poverty. And China is very careful to make that point assiduously with donor organizations like the World Bank or the Global Fund, saying, look, we have this 300 million people or so who are living in abject poverty, so we need your help. Never mind what's going on in the coastal areas in Shanghai and Beijing, which is exceedingly modern and hardly qualifies for any foreign aid. But it is, in a sense, two or more countries. The inequality in income in China is pretty enormous. I'm not, in my own mind, I just don't know whether I would consider China, quote, a developing country or not, even when you put the poor in with the wealthy component. I guess I really need to go out and travel around the western part of China before I come to that conclusion, but certainly based on what I've personally seen in China, it's not a developing country, but I withhold judgment on it. But the point that you're making, I think, is that China remains a recipient nation of foreign assistance, not so much bilateral aid. They get investment, of course, but that's not really aid. That's a different category. The actual aid is coming from international organizations.
Emre Çelik. In regards to the United States, how does the United States view these developing relationships? Are there positive aspects? What are the negative aspects, both generally in terms of the continent of Africa and specifically some of the nations that you've mentioned?
I think for the most part, the United States would view the involvement of China and the other countries too, generally in a positive way. Now, there are exceptions to that. The positive side would be the degree to which all of these nations are providing new investment that is being used for good purposes on the continent, or additional foreign aid, which is being used for good purposes. That's all positive. The degree to which they are providing peacekeepers for UN peacekeeping operations. That's a really positive thing, because that means there isn't any demand for the U.S. to do it. So there are a lot of positive elements to what all of these countries are doing, but there are downsides. The downsides would be the provision of arms, particularly small arms, with very little control over them. And these arms often show up in conflict zones. Chinese, Russian arms are frequently encountered in Darfur, in the Eastern Congo. Not that these governments are selling to rebel groups, they're probably not. But once you put the arms on the continent, they're very fungible, and they can easily go from a government to a rebel group. They can be stolen, they can end up through corruption on arms markets and purchased, and all sorts of horrible things happen to them. And particularly Russia and China are just not being as careful as they should be with the arms. From a Western optic, not a Chinese or a Russian optic, but from a Western optic, there's a lot of concern about the impact that especially China and Russia, Iran, not Brazil, not India, have on not encouraging democratization, good governance, and better human rights practices. In fact, on the contrary, one could argue that these governments are discouraging that kind of a development. And from a Western point of view, that's a very negative trend. So the problem is you have to balance all of this and decide what your priority is, what is more important. And there are positives and there are negatives. With a country like India and Brazil, I would say that the positives far outweigh the negatives. With Russia, Iran, and China, there are more negatives on the ledger than there are with the other countries, but everything considered, probably the positives outweigh the negatives.
Any other questions?
I've thrown an awful lot out there. There must be something that's on your
We
mind.
have some people in the audience that are experts in the field, so please. All right, Sarah, and then we'll come back to you. All right.
Which country would you say is sort of most contributing to the prevalence of counterfeit and pirated goods in China? Or, in Africa?
Yeah, I'm only guessing on that because I don't know for a fact. I mean, those are the kinds of things you just don't have good statistics on, unfortunately. It's all anecdotal information. I would probably have to say that it would be China primarily because they have by far the largest amount of trade from any of those countries that have a tradition or have a history of allowing those kinds of products to be sold outside their borders. Now, there are other countries that I'm sure are complicit, countries like Pakistan, Indonesia, probably India, where you're getting some adulterated products that go in. This frequently happens with medicines, and it certainly happened with some Chinese medicine, mainly adulterated medicine, which can be just terribly harmful, though. I mean, if you think you're getting a proper dose of medicine, and in fact you're getting basically a sugar pill or something, well, you're obviously not going to get well, or very bad things can happen to you. Now, these are primarily, in fact, probably exclusively private manufacturers, even in China, and certainly in India and some of the other countries, they're private. And it's true that the government of China is not very well organized to prevent this sort of stuff, and the Africans are hopelessly prepared to deal with it. I mean, look how long it took the United States to track down some of these products that were coming in from China. And if we can't do it in a timely way, certainly the Africans can't do it. So it's very troublesome, and unfortunately there's probably a lot more of it going on than we even know about. Probably most of it is happening, and no one has any idea what's going on. But as I say, it's not exclusively a Chinese phenomenon. It's just that their volume of trade is so overwhelming as compared to the others that I would have to assume that they contribute the largest amount of it. And the Chinese government's embarrassed by this. I mean, they don't want this to happen either. Nothing worse than trying to explain to the Nigerian public that a load of toothpaste came in that has gunk in it that will burn your mouth out or something. I mean, you just don't want to be in that position, and certainly the government of China doesn't want to be in it. So if they had the ability, they would probably do what they could to crack down on it. But these things just are very hard to control. The one thing China does that is really egregious, and again, it's done by private Chinese companies, but they literally will go to textile sources in Africa, sometimes non-governmental organizations that have these lovely, beautiful designs for textiles. I actually went to one in Swaziland and know for a fact that the Chinese agents or a buyer, maybe an African buyer, went into that NGO, identified these lovely designs for textiles, just bought one of each, took them back to China, duplicated the exact design in China, slapped a Made in South Africa label on them, and then started selling them all over Southern Africa. And of course at a price that was well below what the NGO was selling them for. Now this was a tiny NGO and it didn't really hurt their business that much because they were just selling locally anyway. But I mean, it's really an egregious situation when you go to that length of buying up one copy of some poor NGO's beautiful product, taking it back and running off copies of it in your own machinery at far less cost than the NGO is doing, slapping an illegal label on it, in other words, made in South Africa, it's made in China, and then selling it on a mass production basis throughout Southern Africa. That sort of thing, it seems to me, could be stopped, but it is going on.
Hi, my name is Ellen. My question is, how would you characterize the relationship between some of these non-Western countries on the ground in Africa? For example, I know that there are often tensions and disagreements between China and India in regards to Tibet or other issues. Does that ever play out on the ground with competition for projects or other things of that nature?
Yeah, there's probably less tension and less diplomatic conflict, if you will, on the ground than you might anticipate. There certainly is some business competition on the ground that does manifest itself publicly. In Angola, for example, both Chinese state-owned companies and Indian state-owned companies were competing for oil tracts in Angola. And in this case, the Chinese won and the Indians lost, and the Indians probably suspect there was something going on underneath the table, and whether there was or was not, I have no idea. But the fact is the Indians lost and the Chinese won, and they were not happy campers, according to what I heard. And I have no doubt this happens in other parts of the continent, and again, probably more often between China and India than any other of the countries that I've mentioned, because their needs are very similar, and both countries are significantly involved in the continent. With Russia, they're not really looking for the same thing. They've got all the energy they need in Russia, so they're not competing with the Chinese on those grounds. There may be some competition on arms sales with Russia, but if it's manifested itself in terms of unhappiness or tension, I'm not aware of it. As far as the relationships between the Chinese embassy and the Indian embassy or the Brazilian embassy and any of these other embassies, they get along pretty well, in my experience, pretty much across the board. And it's only when you have a very particular problem, like competition over a commercial deal, that it might become, at least temporarily, a bit nasty at the personal level on the ground. But these are diplomats after all, and they're paid to deal with those kinds of issues, and they generally do, and life goes on, and you don't get too exercised about it. You win some, you lose some. The other side of the coin, the one you didn't really ask the question, but let me make a comment about it, and this applies particularly to the Chinese, although it can also apply to the Indian communities. The Indian communities in Africa are very long-standing in East Africa, and the Indian communities have long been seen as isolating themselves from the African population, being somewhat wealthier, having different customs, different religion, etc., being seen as different. And the feeling has not always been harmonious between the Indian communities and the African communities. And all you've got to do is look at the Idi Amin rule in Uganda when he expelled the entire Asian community from Uganda, because he just decided it was a popular thing to do to kick all the Asians out. And he did, or most of them left. Now, as it happens, they're starting to come back now in relatively small numbers, but Idi Amin's gone, and the Ugandans decided, gee, at least the Asians were good business people, and they got the work done, so maybe we ought to have some back. With the Chinese, it's a different situation. They also have some very long-standing communities in Africa that go back several hundred years, in Madagascar, in Mauritius, a huge community in South Africa, about 300,000 Chinese in South Africa. In a tiny, tiny community in the Congo that goes back to building the railways at the beginning of the last century. But now you have this overlay of new arrivals, of the laborers who come in and work on these huge infrastructure projects, the merchants who are flocking to Africa, the small shop owner, the small businessman, the restaurant owner, the acupuncturist. I mean, they're all over the place now. And these relationships are just sort of getting sorted out. And it's very interesting how it's developing, because it's a real mishmash of both good relationships and hostility developing. And you just can't generalize about it. You can't say that it's good here and bad there, or that it depends upon what the Chinese are doing. There's just no real pattern to it yet, with maybe the exception of those Chinese merchants who come in and end up displacing African merchants, because either they do a combination of work harder, work longer hours, bring in products cheaper from China, undersell the African counterpart who maybe is trying to flog something from Europe or another developing country, or even an African manufactured product, and can't compete, gets forced out of the market and doesn't have a living anymore. And that kind of a person can get very, very unhappy with the Chinese. But on the other hand, the Chinese bring in products to some areas of Africa where there is no viable market now, and all of a sudden you have cheap consumer goods available that didn't used to be available, and the consumers say, this is great. We now have something we didn't used to have. So it's hard to generalize.